started a new section of our study, lesson number 12, and one more after this, and we'll have to decide what we want to do in the future. This dealing with the archaeology of the early church. As we'd seen as you go through this, a lot of the, and it's on page 109, we'd stop there at specific corroborations from Acts. There are several places that are mentioned in the scriptures, and this helps us to verify, as you've seen as you go through. Maybe not as much archaeological evidence, although there is some. Also manuscripts, as we've already talked about, that's equally important, and so forth. We have here on 109 on the lower left hand corner a piece of the Gospel of John. And these are fragments, and it's interesting how they can pin these fragments out. And notice, if you would, it's about the width of what a piece of papyrus would be, as it would be split and then laid out. And I believe they had taken something to crush it and then to form it into paper, so it would be going up and down about so wide on the pages. And of course then they were rolled up, and this is why they appear like that, and they were written on. We have few, if any. I'm not sure that there are any, unless somebody has found some newer scrolls, but my understanding was that there are no original manuscripts left. But there are copies, as we've talked about, and it's important to understand as you look at this material that there were copies of the original. In other words, it wasn't until after John's writing of 96 AD and a few years after that that we had a full copy of the Bible. And so it took a period of time for the Bible to be put together. John's writings, most believe Revelation was in 96 AD, so you're talking around 100 AD or so before all the books were finished and completed. And so basically all you would have is certain books. Some of the epistles are called circuitous letters, like Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians would have been sent to the church of Corinth. They would have read and studied it. They would have copied it and then send it on to somewhere else. And so the same way with some of the epistles of Paul, they were circuitous letters and went from place to place. So mainly they'll probably find just manuscripts, and usually they would be rolled up because of the type of paper that was used. The papyrus would have to be rolled, and you could just imagine something like a papyrus certainly over a period of time would dry out, and then if they ever used it very much, rolling it and unrolling it out, and to look at it and read it and copy it, then roll it back up, you can see why that they would not have lasted too long. This is why we see that there are many fragments of the scriptures. But we do have evidence, especially the first part of this. We see some particular cities that were visited by the apostles, written about by some of the early writers. Luke's, and some have tried to make some discouraging marks, if we want to put it that way, of Luke's writing. But the fact of the matter is, Luke is a very meticulous and was a very educated individual, and we see that he was a man of details. And so sometimes some of these details are denied by the critics because they can't find something or so forth, but yet archaeology through the years, the finding of these manuscripts or of the writings, in the lower right hand corner of page 109 we see this inscription found in Jerusalem. So there were pieces and manuscripts and things like this that were left as evidence, and so we can see that all of these show the inspiration of scriptures. It shows the accuracy, historical accuracy of the scriptures. As I've mentioned before, the Bible's not necessarily a book of history, but if it refers to history, it's absolutely accurate. There are some scientific things in the Bible. The Bible's not a book of science, but anything that's mentioned scientifically has been proven to be absolutely accurate, even the paths of the sea. And that was scoffed at for a long period of time. David just makes or whoever the writer was of that particular psalm, just makes a casual observance of the paths of the sea, just passing, basically. And so the individual contributed to being the pathfinder of the sea found these currents, and these currents are the paths of the sea, and they even have to do with migrations and where fish and whales and other animals of the ocean go. A lot of time is determined by these currents, and they also have to do with weather. It brings weather from one place to another, and so we see the the truth of the scriptures on this matter. If somebody would, let's start with the corroboration. That's a big word. And read down on page 110 to the famine during the reign of Claudius, if somebody would. So all this stuff is just straightforward, so we can read through it. So these are some, at least ideas of some things that points to some of the things that Luke had brought out and some of the other writers of the scriptures. First thing I noticed here as you go through, especially in the first translation up at the top left-hand corner, does that kind of strike you? Those inscriptions, somebody putting that inscription somewhere on this building, this synagogue that they built, does it kind of remind you of anything in our society? They say things haven't changed, and that hasn't changed either. Obviously somebody taking credit for it and putting his name on it. And that's we see a lot of that in our society too, don't we? Especially with politicians. I remember going across the bridge to Michelle's on State Route 22, going across the river there from Steubenville to Weirton, and I believe it's called the Robert C. Byrd Bridge or something like that. And I've often wondered about that. Did he pay for it? No, we paid for it. So, almost he likes to take credit. Obviously, there's even roads built there that has a Robert C. Byrd name, but probably it'd be more accurate to say the People's Road, people of the United States, taxpayers' road, because that's who paid for it. Byrd didn't pay for it. We paid for it. And so I don't know that that's the case here, but we do see that people haven't changed. And there's also another word here, libertine. Does that sound familiar? Right. Yeah. And there is a political party, is there not? They kind of call themselves the Libertines. Pardon me? Yeah, libertarians or libertines would be the very similar terminology, and they're the same for basically little or no laws whatsoever. Is the idea of, and so this the words used. I'm not sure if it's used in the sense in especially Rome, since he would be a free man, then that would say what, as we remember in our Roman history. Remember, Paul was even asked about this. Yeah, if he's a free man, then he'd obviously be a citizen of Rome, and so Paul was asked how he got his freedom. Of course, how did Paul get his? Tarsus, born in Tarsus, which is the Roman province. The other individual asked him, how did he get his? You remember? He paid for it. That was an interesting question. That's just one of those little tidbits as you read through the Bible, but it is kind of impressive that he would ask Paul about that and said, well, I paid for mine. How did you get yours, as we would say today? Because along with the idea of being a free man or a Roman citizen meant a lot if you were a Roman citizen. And so we see here, as we've seen already in our study, that a lot of the Jews, and especially these in the synagogues and in the temple, were also mixed up in politics too. And they were all kind of mixed up into the Roman politics of the time. And had positions because of it. That's the Herod. That's how some of that came in. And the Herods are at least partially Jewish people, and so they were leaders, and it was political favoritism and things like that that got him his position. As we talked about last time, his feeling of somebody was going to take his throne away from him. And so had to do with all politics. So wasn't much of a position, if you ask me. Anyone else have any comments or anything? Then, if somebody would, then the famine during the reign of Claudius, and that goes down, I think, to Damascus. I messed that one up. Candace is the next one, so we'll stop there. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 26, we'll try to look at these passages and kind of get the flow of what Mike, the author here, is doing, is pointing out these things and pointing out the evidence. And also, what did such a thing as a famine, first of all, do for our evidence that we're looking at? Yeah. Okay. Very good. What else? Notice in verse 26, this New King James, and says, when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. Then in verse 27, and probably be more accurate to this particular thing we're talking about, and in these days prophets came up from Jerusalem to Antioch, and the one of them named Agabus stood up and showed that by the Spirit that there is going to be great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. Instead of 26, that probably should be 27, if you want to mark it accurately on in your book. So what does the date do in significance with that famine that's mentioned here? Does it not date the writing for us? We always talk about the importance of dating, so we know that for a certainty that this particular famine was between 41 and 54. If there were other evidences that we could go and find that would have been recorded either by Josephus or other historians, then we could we could place the writing of this particular book in that age group between 41 and 54 AD. So we can know what it's spoken about, and we also know that it's accurate, right? Because even though there's no record of this, there's still records of the famine, so it would be reasonable to believe that this was also be true that the apostle said in the days of Claudius Caesar. And so this gives us an accuracy as to the writing of the text in Acts chapter 11. Luke, as I mentioned, he picks up those little bit of tidbits. So it may seem to be small, but you see what inference they can play in relationship to timing of Bible text. I've always found it fascinating that certain rulers were named and certain people were named at certain times. And of course, that dates books for us too, because we find outside sources, and archaeology is one of the things that helps in that, finding these sources of evidences. And so we know that, like I said, that this was written between 41 and 54 AD. So any thought or question on that, or anyone like to add something to that? Yes, absolutely, and as we talked about that before, because of the time frame and all this too, as opposed to the Old Testament. But that being said, and what Ron says is absolutely true, but and this is the important thing of archaeology, they may come up with some kind of evidence, physical evidence, that also points to this. At this point, it's only through writings. And so we know about Claudius Caesar and his reign, and so this would be through outside sources. So it's interesting how also not only internal evidence but external evidence, as we talked about, shows the inspiration of the Scriptures too. So that's I think a very important point. Yeah, and that's what God wanted them to do. They were staying at Jerusalem in the early part of the church, and so there's a persecution that spread them. But certainly, you look historical evidence, famines usually do cause migrations. In the 30s here, the Dust Bowl and the out west, that caused a lot of major migrations. So we see evidence of that. So yes, that's and so the word spreading is God wanted it to. So that's good, and so this will give us some evidence. Yes, absolutely. Anyone else? Let's, before we read candidacy, let's turn to Acts 8 and verse 27. I think this is kind of interesting that we can see the accuracy of Luke and the little tidbits that Luke comes up with. And they might seem insignificant, but as you look at the text or look at the evidence, it's not insignificant because it helps to date. So someone like Luke writing certainly could pick up some evidence that others wouldn't. In verse 27, Acts 8 and verse 27, it said, "So he rose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who was charged of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem to worship." First of all, isn't that really picking up details when Luke adds this, Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians? That really picks up small details, doesn't it? And someone would probably come along, critics of the Bible, and they have with the book of Acts, and there's been other occasions where they've taken the book of Acts to task, saying that there's no such thing or so forth. So here one particular point is picked up, and that is that there was these queens, Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians. And also, what's that tell us about the Jewish nationality? There were Jews in Ethiopia. Obviously, he was a Jew. This man wasn't a proselyte, he was a Jew. And not too long ago, and I forget where it was, that they had come across with some evidence that there were Jews in Ethiopia. There was also Christians in Ethiopia too, and so it had spread as far as Ethiopia also, which is in Africa. And when I was at Florida College, there was a boy there, David Agunzala, and he was from Ethiopia. And his dad was supposedly one of the chiefs in Ethiopia. He was studying Bible at the time. And so has it there, has it now. Isn't that interesting? How things have not really changed all that much, and how the gospel spread and how it yet spreads today. So if somebody would, go ahead and read the Queen of Ethiopians, or Ethiopians. Did they understand anything about I thought that was just a little bit odd. Anybody think anything a little bit odd there? Yeah, but it says regarded obesity as an attribute of royalty. Was it an attribute, or was it a way to get rid of the queens? Someone fed a little bit too much milk. I wouldn't think it's going to last too long. And you know, remember what they do to calves? Nice little product called what is that called? Yeah, veal. Thank you, Becky. Veal's wonderful, and that's how they get veal. They take calves and they feed them nothing but milk, and then they slaughter them, and it is really great meat. But I think that's one of those non-political things today that's not very popular with a lot of people. I don't know if they're still doing veal or not. They're still doing it, Linda says. Yeah. And it is, a veal cutlet is just really good meat. You just can't hardly beat it. But there is a cruelty to it, I guess. But of course, you butcher any animal, and you could say, at least for as far as the cow's concerned, or any particular animal, I guess it would be that way to them. But that is quite interesting. And also, what about this name? These group of queens called Candace. We've run across that earlier too in some of our texts. What was that about? Remember, we had lineages of kings. So sometimes it was difficult to know what particular king to things down because of the fact that they would take this name. So obviously this was a practice also, even in New Testament time, of calling regardless of what their names were, they were Candace, and that's what they were called. And I don't know if there's 1, 2, 3, or 4. Doesn't seem to indicate that, but I thought that was interesting too, that we've already covered the situation in the Old Testament, especially with kings, and you wonder, well, how could they have been in 200 or 300 years, and so it was just a common name. Much I think, do they still do that in England with the King of England and stuff? I think they kind of hold a name, or do they not? They hadn't, for a period of time, held certain names as part of the royalty, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. Let's turn to Acts 9 and verse 11 then. This is another interesting point. Once again, one of those insignificant things, you might think. Verse 11, so the Lord said to him, arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he is praying. So somebody would read the Damascus then for us? Okay, so once again, and did we not have a picture of the straight street? I thought there was a picture here somewhere. Oh, okay, there it is. Eyes aren't focusing the way they should. Yes, that's the street called Straight. I've always was fascinating with that when you read that. Go to the street called Straight. Number one, they named their streets or gave them a name of some sort. This one was particularly rather relevant because of what, as we see here? Yeah. And as you look at this one, it was straight. And so it's called Straight Street. And once again, that's one of those little tidbits that maybe nobody ever thought about, but now, and especially finding with this arch there, that, you know, if that was preserved, I'm not sure if it's uncovered, if that's the arch that they're talking about, and so you could walk through that same arch that Paul walked through and go down the straight street and be in the general area where Paul was waiting for Ananias. So that's interesting too, plus the fact that it does give us some other evidences of the scriptures. Then Artis, perhaps how you say that. Let's turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 32. Verse 32 says, in Damascus, the governor under Artis, the king, was guarding the city of Damascenes with the garrison desired to arrest me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hand. That's another one of those little things that Luke had picked up in his writings, or this would be about Paul in his writings at this time. Someone like to read that for us? Another one of those situations in which it gives us a date of when this particular event happened. Once again, that is significant in biblical history to know these dates and give us a general time of that. And you know, there'll probably be more discoveries made and maybe even specifically narrow that date down to that very thing. So once again, dates are sometimes a little bit more important than we might think about in the scriptures. And then, of course, the person might say, well, how did somebody come up with that date? And so there are events like this, and many of these dates are from extra, outside of biblical writings. So they're secular writings, historical writings, things that are dated. And so this can also help to demonstrate the inspiration of the scriptures. And we talked about this a little bit earlier too, about this divorce. And so we're coming back to it again, which is quite interesting. The Nabateans, Petra, and if you saw any of the, what are those ones that were made? It's not the Ark of the Covenant. Is that what they were called? What's his name made? Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant. Is that right? There was one of them, I forget which one, and it has a picture of them coming down a narrow street with cliffs. I mean, it was just going between two rocks, and there's a huge cliff, and right at the end of it, then you see this building carved in rock. That's Petra. And that stuff wasn't filmed in there, believe me. That's one of those historical things that still is that way today. But Petra was this was the capital, and that was carved out of stone. And so we often thought about that as you read through and see these things. Anyone have any question or comment? We're out of time this evening. We'll stop at the cities of Paul visited. Once again, I think we'll see as we go through that some of the cities, some of the names like this also shows us some evidence. So we have more of this type of evidence as opposed to pottery, as Ron mentioned, and other pieces. We have secular, or that which is written is to evidence of some of the New Testament. But once again, especially when manuscripts and so forth are found, and also other artifacts, then they also help to narrow down or show that these things were true in the Bible. And then on page 111, you see several. You might want to look at these, and some of these would have been, especially the Areopagus there in Athens, Mars Hill, as it's called. At least it's kind of a skeleton. It's not as it certainly would have been in the day of Paul, but that's where Paul went before those individuals. Why was Paul there at Mars Hill? You remember? And most of his journeys, anywhere he went, he always took advantage of this. It was a meeting place that men of the city would get gathered together. Sometimes they were at the gates of a city, but this was a place that individuals were gathered and would discuss things. And so I don't know how Paul found out, but he took that advantage of that opportunity to go there to Mars Hill and to speak to these individuals. And so that's another little thing as you go through the scriptures you pick up, especially with Paul. And what about Lydia? Remember where he had met Lydia? Well, somebody can look for that next time we're out of time. So those are places that the Apostle Paul availed himself of taking the opportunity to teach individuals the gospel. And it's very specific if you look as to why Paul went to that particular place that day to preach. So any other questions or comments? appreciate everyone's participation this evening.
So